All right. Good evening, everybody. This is TJ from Passend Education on a mission to make gifted kids more happy, autonomous, and successful. And welcome to our weekly Q&A. We're going to be talking today about AI and in particularly how AI has an impact on gifted kids, because that seemed to have been a very urgent question with a lot of parents. So I've taken a bit of time to look into particularly what kind of studies I could find around giftedness and AI, and how we can potentially learn from some other research that talks a bit about how gifted kids and how normal kids supposed to be interacting with AI. Because there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of bans, a lot of stuff being moved from classrooms in countries like Norway, Sweden. And I think it's a good time to really delve deeply into this. So for those parents, obviously, that are here with us live right now, please put any other questions that you have in the chat. Or if I've got a few questions for you guys, please, you can use raising your hands to answer some of these things. I'm hoping to see if we can get some interactivity today. Right, so without further ado, let's get started. So I want to actually start with the idea, that the idea of AI itself is that it doesn't automatically change everything that we have. So let's start with a question. How many of your kids, or who has had their kids use AI in the last couple of days, maybe last couple of weeks? If you have had your kids do something with AI that you are worried about, raise your hands. Let's see how many of you have had your kids talking to Chat, GPT, or any other AIs. Okay. And then at the same time, I would like to ask you, what did they use that for? So what have your kids been using AI for? Specifically, things like homework, you name it, right? So let us know. In that case, let's talk a bit about like what AI is and what it does, right? So first of all, in our classes, we've been noticing that when we do projects, that there is some kids that have really a disdain for AI, which can be kind of a good thing. But we also see that some of our gifted kids are really grabbing the chatbots as quick as they can. And they're quickly replacing Google searches with AI searches. And there's a lot of data that shows that Google itself is being replaced by AI searches in terms of finding information and so on, right? So that is a trend. Whether it's a worrying trend or not is still up for debate. I have some thoughts on what is right or not, but let's have a look first at what we have seen and that we know that is kind of problematic for gifted kids. So one of the things that we've been observing is that AI on its own isn't necessarily good or bad, but it seems to be an amplifier towards certain kind of behaviors. And we know with gifted kids that some behaviors are already amplified by the fact of them being gifted kids to begin with, right? So the two things coming together seem to have more extreme effects on our gifted kids than they have on non-gifted kids. And that is either good or bad, depending on what is happening, right? So some of the things that we can see that actually are strengths that a lot of gifted kids have is that gifted kids tend to be very curious. The need for more information, the need to think about things, to have complex thoughts, to ask for more, to learn quickly, particularly in early ages, is already very much present with our gifted kids. What we see when AI is used is that this seems to be amplified, right? So this seems to be a positive thing. We've seen kids jump into AI chats and then start talking to the AI bot, and then a lot of information keeps coming back and forth. And this, at its face value, looks like a good thing. So it seems to be addressing a curiosity need with a lot of our gifted kids. So that is one thing that is positive. In some cases, when we have very fierce, independent, gifted kids that don't like to listen to adults or to others, ChatGPT seems to be able to bridge that particular gap for some of them, where they are asking for things on their own. And we've got a lot of kids coming to class where they go, oh, I found this out. I found this out. They'll show us their chats and go, hey, I've been asking this. Isn't this interesting? Right. So there's a lot of independence that, like, some of these kids, that is being reinforced. Again, that is a good thing. We normally would look for that. And also, fast learning. Now, particularly in early stages of gifted kids development, a lot of gifted kids are still very eager to learn new things. A lot of gifted kids teach themselves how to read, how to do math, and that stage in life, when which normally takes, starts like waning a little bit by the time they become into their teens, in our experience, is still a fast learning time. And ChatGPT or other AI seem to be able to accelerate this bit as well, because obviously there's an immediate response. I ask a question, I get something back, and that, again, as a face value, looks like a good thing. But we also see some other amplification. So really poor amplifications are perfectionism. When ChatGPT seems to be very focused on, giving detailed answers. If you ask a little bit deeper, particularly the way, if you start a really good conversation with them, there's opportunities for gifted kids to see that there is a rabbit holes that they still have to go, that they could get stuck into. And with a lot of gifted kids, when they get too involved with ChatGPT, that can actually increase the level of perfectionism that they experience. Another challenge that they have is that basically the easy answers that are often given are opportunities for them to avoid challenge. Gifted kids are in this weird state sometimes where what they really need and what they deep down want is more deep challenge, but they're not necessarily provided this challenge immediately. And then some of them build up reluctance towards this challenge. So we get a lot of kids that are afraid to fail. Obviously, their emotional states, being hypersensitive to fear of failure, doesn't help with this. And ChatGPT allows them to sort of transfer the ownership of any answer that they give to these particular chatbots, which could be really like, to them, feels like, oh, that works. Like, and if they're not noticed as being using the chatbots themselves to give the answers, a lot of people think, oh, they're answering this themselves, right? So that loop can create situations where a lot of gifted kids can get into trouble. And then the last one that we see, a lot of gifted kids we work with have issues making choices. It's very common for them. It's very linked to fear of failure. It's also linked to having too many scenarios in their head. So this intellectual oversensitivity that they tend to have allows them to make a lot of connections. And when you get a lot of connections, particularly uncertain connections, it can sometimes feel very overwhelming to make choices. And gifted kids engaging with AI, getting even more information, can sometimes get even more stuck in what we call analysis paralysis. And that is, again, an issue. Now, what I want to say with this, because AI doesn't change, the question here is like, does it? Right? Like, is that true or not? Because as far as I'm concerned, who you are and how effective you are going to be in life has a lot to do with the habits that you manage to build. And we know that the formative years between 1 and 6 years are extremely crucial for like social behavior patterns, but a lot of other things as well. Like, we know that, like, in that particular first 6 years, what we do with the kids is really, really important. And then it's still important from 6 to 12. But as they get older and older, the role that the environment has, and that we as parents have particularly, starts to slowly diminish a bit. And we go from, full protectors to shepherds, basically. Right? And therefore, we need to ask ourselves, like, particularly at what stage should we be introducing AI? I'll talk a bit about that later, but it's an interesting question to ask, right? So these are the three things on each side, positive and negative, that we see for gifted kids seem to be a bit of a challenge. But there is a few other really, really extreme hidden risks that don't necessarily like show easily, hence hidden risk, that we have to be wary of. And this one we tend to see a little bit more with our older kids, particularly our teens, struggle with this a lot, right? So The first one is less productive struggle. One of the key reasons that gifted kids need specialized support in school is that they're understimulated in their classes. And that's mostly because they've already learned things by themselves. Um, so things are just easy to start. Also because they can make connections happen more quickly, and therefore they might actually run into a situation where um, it becomes even harder for them to learn. And sorry, there's like a lot of bonking on the door in the back. Give me a quick second. All right. There we go. My cat was stuck in one of the room, and it was really distracting me. So here we go. Right. So less productive struggle. So gifted kids learn fast, therefore they're understimulated. And when there's an easy out, like asking an AI for help, things can get even easier for them. And that struggle is necessary. We need to provide some level of challenge for them to learn metacognition skills. A lot of the other videos we've been watching on this channel really talk about like that level of challenge being the main reason gifted kids really struggle. And what we see is that when they use AI, the productive struggle, like stuff that they get stuck on, there seems to be a mismatch, right? So, and then that easy out really gets in the way of actual learning, right? So that's the first one, less productive struggle. The other thing is false mastery. Now, one of the things that is really difficult with AI, and a lot of people don't necessarily understand this very easily, LLMs at its core are not necessarily intelligent yet. What they're doing is they're predicting the likeliness of a certain word to be used. And the best way to explain this, for those that don't know much about AI yet, is that if I say hello to somebody, the most likely response is hello back. But time and place have an impact on what the correct response is. So you could say hello, you could say hi, but if it's evening, you could say good evening. There's lots of different follow ups that contextually might be an appropriate kind of response. And depending on who the people are involved, there's even more predictability you can throw at it. So the first word that's going to come out of somebody's mouth is not 100% known, but given enough variables, you can predict with really accurate numbers what is the next word that is being said. And the way that it gets more and more complex through machine learning is that basically most of the questions that we ask an LLM have been asked in some form. If there's a 1 in billion chance that a certain question has already been asked, then there's like 8 people that have asked that question. And realistically, most questions being asked specifically by kids in school have been asked many a times. Therefore, the algorithms can figure out what the correct answer should be in most of those situations. And the way that it figures that out is that as long as somebody doesn't say, "Oh, that doesn't work, I need something more," like the goal almost of an LLM or chatbot is to try and stop having a conversation by giving the best answer that is the most likely hit of the right sequence of words that basically give you the answer that you want. And do that often enough and do that complex enough, it might, to us humans, it feels like you're talking to a real human. What is problematic with that is that sometimes, and actually quite often, the LLMs predict something wrong. And often that is then called hallucinating. It means that either some data was missing, or just a glitch, or it could have just been that enough people said something really silly, and therefore that became the actual answer. Like, so hallucinating is a complex thing on its own. And as we collectively engage with chatbots, things to get more and more accurate in most situations. But where this becomes really difficult, and when we're going to talk about creativity specifically later, that doesn't always hold up. And where gifted kids really struggle is that they often ask questions that contextually are different than what other kids ask. And therefore, the way that they interact with chatbots can have more of a mismatch, because often the actual chatbots start learning how old the kids are. There's lots of ways that these chatbots can do this. That the information is definitely not very secure. So what we see is that a lot of kids start building up this false mastery, this idea that like whatever the chatbot says is true, even though the hallucinations are severe, like quite severe. And we know as adults when we work with LLMs, we work particularly in our workflows with them, that there's a lot of stuff that is wrong. So we need to check for things. But when we talk about really young kids, um, and not even just the young kids, to be honest, what we tend to see is that they think they know stuff, therefore they'll accept the answer from a chatbot. And but what is really nasty about this, chatbots are a little bit sycophantic in nature, so they'll answer what you, particularly if it's learned a bit about like how you behave, are most likely going to accept as the right answer. So that false mastery is a real big problem. And again, the gifted nature of asking certain questions out of context, that like can make hallucinations happen even more frequently. Therefore, it's really not reliable as a first source of information. Now, the last one is creativity. And it might help to define what creativity is, because the way I define it is being creative means that you either have completely novel ideas that nobody has ever thought of before, or you combine existing ideas in a novel way. Now, from a personal creative perspective, it doesn't really matter if somebody else has come up with the idea already. Like if I live on one side of the globe and somebody else lives on the other side of the globe, and we have not interacted with each other whatsoever, and we have this exact same creative thought, then we could argue we're still acting creatively, right? And creativity is kind of measured against the overall outputs of everybody else. So if everybody has a particular style of output, then there's a certain amount of people at the end that output it differently. So you could actually put creativity on a bell curve effectively to say, okay, like where are you? Are you on this side here? Are you in the middle? Like most people will fit within this particular bit. And therefore, we could say, okay, if you do such stuff that is all the time here, you're more creative. Um, what is really important here, though, is that when you start looking at ChatGPT and you start seeing all these already existing things, because ChatGPTs and other LLMs, they learn from training data, which is output from human beings, and they put them together in novel ways. So you could argue that like they're being creative, but it has a lot more to do with statistical likeliness of finding things and a little bit of raw computing power. And there's an argument to be had that we saw this very early on in LLMs, that sometimes LLMs were able to find long forgotten information. I mean, there's so many scholars nowadays that little studies about things that actually are maybe important or significant are kind of buried under the noise of everybody producing things, right? So, like Charles Darwin, when he was writing his stuff, there was not that many people actually writing similar kind of things. So, was his theory really good? Probably it was. Was it also, did it help that nobody else was doing anything really similar, close enough, so he could produce it without the noise of something else? Sure. But nowadays, we also have smaller, maybe sometimes more impactful studies that just don't get found. And what LLMs were very good at is finding some of these things sometimes and then showing them, and that looks like a new discovery has been made. But in almost all situations there, what is really happening is that we're just rediscovering lost information in a way, which is kind of a good thing as far as I'm concerned, that AI can potentially do this. But we tend to see that as like, oh, that's a creative person, because we judge the output of ChatGPT as if it's a human being in front of you. It's and therefore we say, oh, I've never seen this, therefore that sounds creative to me. But if you would be able to see that maybe some other people have already had that idea somewhere, then you can say, oh, that is not real creativity. And when we see our gifted kids offload that creative thought, which is the area where they're supposed to be really strong, then we have to be a bit worried about what that does to their own long-term well-being. We don't really know what impact that's going to have, whether that's going to make them feel more creative or less creative. What we do know is that when we stifle gifted kids' creativity, we see long-term difficulties in their academic performance and in their happiness markers. So we know that stifled creativity in normal educational settings are a bad thing for all kids, but specifically for gifted kids, because they are, by their very nature, more creative, more different than, and they think differently, right? Therefore, there's a big question mark here, like what impact are we going to have on our gifted kids when it comes down to it, right? So these are the hidden things that we need to be careful of. AI is super duper powerful. It allows us to do lots of things, but at the same time, like it needs judgment. And then the question really becomes, can you formulate judgment if you basically put all your struggle away because you're not no longer worrying about like where am I get the information. And I know for a fact that whenever we bring some of our kids into the school libraries to just search for things, which is different than going into the school libraries to read a book. Right? A lot of the kids that we see in international schools, they have these little trips and they pick a book and they sit down and they read something, and that's good. It's good for them to sit still and read because that's a skill on its own. But when we actually bring them into a library to say, okay, go find a specific book, go, how does an index work? How do you find something? Like struggling to get stuff like that, they don't know what they're doing. They enjoy it once they get into it, but it's a skill that we have to learn, that you wouldn't think would be something you would have to work on. And it is really important that they get this skill, because if you can't verify information, because everything comes from um, one source, we know that's a problem, and that will be the same for AI, right? So um, those are the three hidden things that we can see are really problematic, and we know that gifted kids really, really struggle with these. I want to talk a bit about creativity because I think one of the ideas and one of the uncertainties, one of the reasons a lot of parents ask, like, what should we do, is because it looks like we're on the prefaces of a shift away, similarly to when the steam engine was invented or the book press was invented. And there's a lot of situations where a big technological shift has changed the entire structure of how we engage with the world. And that short term seems to always have a bit of an impact on what used to look like safe kind of jobs where you could earn an honest bit of living. And now, what is the next step? What should we do? Um, Now, might be interesting to have a look back in time. Like, what was the original thing that got changed? So the first, like, manual labor was basically the first thing that got replaced, and that process when they invented the steam engine wasn't instant. The first steam engines weren't particularly strong or useful. It was hard to measure what they could do, and in the early stages, most seasoned workers would outproduce these steam engines, right? So these big, stinky, big machines that like would break down, would be kind of dangerous on occasion. Like one moment in history, I can't remember the name of the actual worker involved. There was like a champion miner in the U.S. Whose job was to basically cut holes for the railway systems, like through mountains and stuff. And he was extremely fast. And every time a new steam engine would be invented, he would be pitted against the steam engine to see which one would, beat which. And then every time the worker would win, there would be newspaper, but he does it again. And the funny thing is that took a couple of years, and then one machine beats that person, and all of a sudden the floodgates opened up, and we, nobody digs tunnels by hand anymore, right? So manual labor was kind of the first thing um, that was sorry, labor. that was basically changed, right? So what what did we change into? Because what was the next step then? Because if machines are now stronger than us, surely we can do something different, right? So for manual labor, the next was labor of the mind, right? So people's, and we've seen this from like early 1900s all the way up to basically the last 2020s. Everything was about knowing more, using your mind. And you could actually argue that we've already been surpassed in some aspects by computers in the mind before. And one key moment in this is when one of the first computers beat the first chess player. Like that process, that was when algorithms were learning how to play chess. There was always a big hoo-ha about the grandmasters beating particular chess robots, and effectively that took a while until such a time that I believe it was called Deep Blue, beat the then reigning chess champion. And from that point on, we kind of accepted that certain things, particularly when it comes to calculating stuff, computers could just do better, right? So when we have manual labor, we had machines taking over, right? And then we had mind labor. There we go. Mind labor being overtaken by computers. Then what was the next step there, right? So we had simple calculations and so forth and so forth. That was done. So we would still have effectively complex thinking, right? So we would have complex thinking. That was going to be the next step. So how do you make systems? How do you combine things that calculate? How do you automate things? And for the longest time, that's where we sat, which is why people said, oh, coding is where it is, because coding is basically the thing that you need to overcome just doing calculations or just writing stuff down, right? So we went from complex, and what we see here is that it looks like AI is going to be able to overtake all of this, right? And that's where we are. So what is the next step? And to me, the next step is being creative, right? That's really important. And being creative is all about like original thought. And I think where we're going to be ending up with original thought is a lot of theological philosophy, things that basically are all about like the why of our internal well-being. I truly believe that's where we're going to go with all of this. And it's probably where a lot of our kids need to go too. And it's one of those questions we have to ask when it comes down to making choices for your A levels. It's like, okay, what impact is AI going to have on the kind of things your kids need to learn? Because in a sense, like, and this is the tricky part, coding, for example, Claude is basically saying, yeah, it's going to go the way of the dodo. It's going to be as easy as sending a text message. And that seems to be true until it isn't. And the easy way to explain this is actually based on the works of Professor David H. Cropley from the University of South Australia, who does a lot of research, particularly on creativity, right? And he has been for years, like for the first time I ran into him, it was good 4 years ago. He was doing tests to see how creativeness was applied by AI, and in what way it would compare against humans. And he's done quite a lot of research on this. And he started off quite like, oh, I'm not sure. Very recently, he's very, very strong. It's like whoever like says anything that AI is actually creative doesn't know what they're talking about. He's becoming more and more vocal about the idea that AI, and particularly in the current format that we have it, is not really capable of being truly creative. And that has a lot to do with the fact that like the when you look at creativity overall for all of humanity, you can see that like AI itself struggles to come up with really truly novel ideas. And this is the model that he sort of champions. I've tried to edit it a little bit to make it easy to read, but what we're looking at is the frequency in which creative things happen, right? And then we put creativeness, particularly when it comes to innovation, because that's kind of where most business study centers come in. They say, okay, we have below average, which is kind of not useful, average, where most people are, good, things that are like useful and often applied. And then we get to excellent and breakthrough stuff, like the really crazy things that are completely new ways of thinking about things. And um, every time he does a study like this, you can see that the actual frequency of good and average in AI models, this blue graph is the AI models, is much more common. And therefore, if you compare that against like a lot of humans, right? And this one, yeah, you can shift a little bit left. Like, and this, what is happening is AI is moving slowly to the right. Okay, so effectively, it's getting closer and closer to probably more like good, which means at a certain point, AI is going to produce more creative work that is close to excellent at a higher frequency than humans would. And that's what we're seeing now, right? So where he started very much on the left, like things were objectively terrible, and it's moving more and more and more to the right. And that means if we look at creativity as a how does something look novel to me, because that's how most people experience creativity, like how does somebody else do something different? If somebody else does something very different than me, I would say that's a creative person. Not always a successful person, it's a very different thing, but generally speaking, oh, that's a different way of thinking about it. And if AI does that more often, more often, more often than the average number of people, then eventually, as far as the majority of people is concerned, AI is more creative. And that's where we're starting to see a lot of people say stuff. And it's probably also the reason why Professor Cropley is getting so upset with people saying that AI is so creative. It's just like technically what you should be looking at is like, how come I can start thinking and more creative thoughts? And maybe that's essentially what we say about like, where do we need to go? We need to become more creative. We need to do things that nobody's thought of, which basically means we have to do things that are probably going to fail. Most creative thoughts don't work out. That's a really important thing to understand as parents, right? So our highly creative humans are really, really important. They're going to be important to challenge status quos, and to a certain extent, because we know that AI in its current form isn't really good at being 100% accurate. We need people that can fact check AI. And that on its own is also a skill that you cannot develop if you don't pay your pound of flesh in trying to sit still and work through ideas and difficulties, right? So this is where creativeness sits and why it's so important, and why we still need human labor. But if you're trying to help your kids to get kind of like ready at this level, which is where accounting would sit. I mean, this is where accounting would sit. This is where coding sits, and then this is technically where philosophy and yeah, management and all that kind of stuff sits. So, but and another one that's interesting is that okay, if we then have to manage and fact check things, do we have people that can manage and fact check people? And I think that's where psychology actually is a very important one, or education for that matter. And within that, like I do think our job as educators, and in the same way as you as parents, is to really figure out, okay, what can I do to help my kids become more creative? And it doesn't mean sending them to an art class. That's learning a skill. What it means is creating a situation where they can do weird and silly things that might not work, that might be tricky, that might have an open end that doesn't always come out of it. And that means gritting your teeth, because sometimes how you could get something done, but just telling them this is how it's done stops that kind of learning process. And this is again a problem where AI comes in, because AI tends to do this really, really, really quickly, right? So that is a big chunk on how creativity can have an impact on our gifted kids. So let's look at this then. There's another interesting study that came out very recently, early this year, I believe it's May, where they took a good chunk of kids. I think it was about 300 330 kids, which for these kind of studies is a decent number. And they put them into three groups. One where there was no access to AI at all. There was one where they had access to AI immediately, and then the last group only got access to AI after attempting something first. And then they looked at like, okay, performance, like how well did they do in remembering things. They looked at metacognition accuracy, so they try to figure out how does this impact their learning abilities, and then how many errors would they make. And what was kind of interesting is that the ones that had AI available immediately, um, they did worse on tests when the AI was taken away, which was obviously concerning. And this is very common with a lot of tests that have been done, a lot of things online about like the next generation being not as smart or not surpassing the previous generation, which has been the kind of the rule up until now, right? So that kind of confirms what a lot of other studies are saying. The no AI one, do see better results, and still have some errors in it. So this is the normal status quo. But the best results came after only allowing AI after attempts were made without AI first. And that is kind of an interesting bit here because like what time frame does this apply to? How can you manage that? Like from an education perspective, how do you manage it from a parent perspective? Really interesting stuff. Like how do we do this, right? So completely taking it away doesn't actually make things better. And I think if we were to just say, okay, no, we just take it away because obviously you can see option one is terrible. Let's take it completely away. We're creating a big divide, and the answer is that like both things can be true at the same time. You need no AI practice, and then having the ability to use it afterwards seemed to be really good. And all of this is all in moderation, of course, right? So timing is important. Which stage do we do this? When do we bring it in? And I do think that like maybe in primary school this is not the best time. There's lots of other reasons why Sweden and Norway have decided to take all of that stuff off the table, because there's other reasons why memorization is better when you do things analog. It has a lot to do with that. There's lots of other senses, touch and smell, and like just time itself, weight. There's lots of things that we can use to memorize things that don't happen when you use digital medium. So that on its own is already really important. There's another big thing about like light and other kind of stuff. Like it's very clear that when it comes down to studying, particularly up until like this really young age, um, is better if you do it analog. And that means no AI as well at that stage. But then again, at what stage do we introduce that? And what opportunities do we have, right? So, um, yeah, I think keep in mind that your job as a parent is, particularly with your younger kids, is to still be a shepherd, which means you need to protect them from certain dangers. And as you've seen with some of the hidden problems and the fact that like there is like a better or worse thing to do when it comes to AI, there is a role that you need to play. And how can we do that? Well, that depends a little bit on like what you already allow yourself. And I'll give you a little bit of another tip that we can do around like organizing AI with this, because I truly believe, and this is really really important, people that are just going to come and say, oh, we're AI integrators and we have these cool tools and like all this kind of stuff. The reason we've not been using a lot of AI tools with our kids yet is because to me, the burden of proof whether the AI intervention suggested works is on the people making the AI, not the other way around. So I'm not a big fan of saying, oh, let's try it and see what happens. No, like you made a tool, you figure out if it works, because there is an element towards AI that basically shows that it has a tendency to sort of go against our own interests, right? There's a lot of reasons why AI is dangerous in other ways, like the sycophantic nature of AI can get people into a lot of trouble around self-harming or even worse, right? So that is very clear. Um, and some people say that's because it's evil. I maybe we could say like the math itself leads to evil bits, or there's something else there when it comes down to like how we decide what is best and what is enough. Like wanting like infinite growth is technically a problem in capitalism, is a problem in anything, and technically that's where a lot of AI struggle. So what do we do at home? What should we do? Well, the first rule is everything that kids do, they should try without using AI first. That's essentially the behavior that you're looking for. Now, the way to do this from a positive discipline perspective is not by getting angry when they do use AI, but it's about when they don't use AI and they try to figure out something by themselves. You applaud them. You reinforce it. You tell them, okay, I saw you do this and you tried it yourself. That's great. Right. And whether that creates a mess, because that comes with that, and that mess could be in making mistakes, that mess could be in, if it's cooking or whatever, it could be a physical mess. That's the other thing that we have to be very mindful of, that like if we want these kids to get really good at trying first, we have to be okay with them being messy. We have to let them explore things, which like Neil deGrasse Tyson is very famous for saying things like, hey, when kids grab an egg, we tell them to be careful and then we take the egg away. And he says, let the kid crush the egg, let it fall down, let it make a mess, let it figure out that if you're not careful, like things can happen. Because like crushing an egg, it's not a big deal. It doesn't really matter that much. It is one of the other reasons why we're moving towards more dangerous playgrounds as well. Like we spoke about risky playgrounds in one of our other sessions the other day. Um, being messy, making mistakes, falling down, hurting yourself, it's such an important part of learning things. And if we already stop that from happening when they're really young, the chances that you'll be modeling that kind of behavior when they get older, when they have to do this, like it gets harder, right? So um, I had this summer camp in the Netherlands that I used to go to, where basically the way that summer camp used to work was like a big fields close to a bit of trees, a forest line ish, and there was just tons and tons and tons of wood junk, like old pallets, like lots of wood that was donated by a bunch of factories, you name it. It was all there. And we would go there like 10 years old, and there would be a guy there that was 16 that said, okay, this is a saw, this is how it works, this is a hammer, this is how that works. Here's like a box of nails. Go build a house. And time of my life, because like how cool is it that you can build your own fort, and we would go like 4 meters high with the thing. Would people get hurt? Yeah, like not like lethally so, but we definitely learned like, okay, like don't hit your hand with a hammer, that hurts, like, yeah, things like that. And with saws as well, there's ways to saw, and you have to be mindful. But most people, if they saw themselves, that like a bandage can solve it, to be honest. And it teaches you a lot of self-control. Now again, what does this look like in your house? Like, what do they try new things without ChatGPT? And it might be good to observe, because it could well be that they're grabbing ChatGPT because they're constantly being told this is wrong, this isn't right. And this is really important for our parents that are going to private schools that follow the Malaysian curriculum, or like my kids go to Chinese school, and I see this a lot, where they have to erase mistakes that they made. And that's the first thing that I would say, just stop doing that, because that stops them trying. So that's the first step. Try it first. If then you want to introduce AI, and I think it's important that you think about this like 12 years is kind of better. I've caught my boy using ChatGPT, and I've been actively like telling them, oh, let's look for stuff without it. Like look deeper, like try to go into actual Google. And I did this with my class. And to be honest, like I had a class for year 2 and 3 last Tuesday. So about 9 kids, all year 2 or 3, and they were asked to do some research on probes that we send to different planets, find the probe that they like, figure out like why it was sent there and all that kind of stuff. And then I just said, look, I don't want you to use the AI answer. It's probably wrong. I want you to find more detailed information on the right kind of website. And I want you to share with each other what is a good website that you found. And then I want you to compare the answer that the AI gives to what you researched. And very quickly they landed on the NASA site, which has like literally every probe with pictures and everything else that you would want in there. And they were getting really enthusiastic about it. And funny enough, they forgot to look at the AI challenge in that. Like, and there was like a moment when the class was super still, and like one of the kids was like, "Why is it so quiet?" Because like delving deep into that new thing and learning stuff like that actually does work, right? So if you have them a little bit younger, like try to steer them away from ChatGPT if you can. But if you feel that they're ready for it, or if they're a little bit older kids, what you can do is you can ask them to ask for hints. There is a trick that you can do, is like that. I think if you help kids that are a bit younger than 12 years, where you make your own GPT. For those that don't know, like most of the AI models allow you to sort of pre-program a part of the large language model to do certain things. And this is how a lot of business flows get made. Like for maybe for a lot of you this sounds very familiar, but basically a chat GPT has the option to make a GPT. You spend some time talking to the GPT itself to say, this is what I want, and you can basically make a GPT that is set up and geared, and they already exist. Actually, you can find them too, where the goal is that they have to act like a teacher, and and it's not allowed to give an actual answer, but just give hints, right? So that's one way that you can limit this, because one of the good things is with all these LLMs, you can see what they've gone through and what they've asked. So I would recommend you give them your own login, and then you can see what they're talking about and see what they're doing, and then you can have constructive, open conversations about like, hey, I saw that you were just asking questions directly. Like, are you sure it's right? Let's figure that out. So that's a learning opportunity on its own, and it's a lot better than automatically just accepting the work that is there. And again, like a lot of times when kids do it, it's because they're under work pressure or anything else. So it's your job in this to try and see if you can get ahead of this. Like, can you spend some time with them doing their homework? Or, like if they might get into a little bit of time pressure, because one of the other dangers that I see is that some of the work some of the teachers are giving, because they generated with GPT, like they expect the kids to do it quicker, right? So it becomes a bit of a self-reinforcing loop. But this is important. Like, can you give me a clue? That's the language. That's okay, because that is them using it as help, not as a replacement. Um, Another loop in this is that you can have the actual large language models check the work that you're doing. And I think when it comes down to like using LLMs responsibly, I think that's a good way, because when you ask, okay, I've written something, can you look at this and tell me if structurally there's things that I can improve? Can you tell me whether like this matches with what the rubrics are for an exam, things like that? In those situations, it's actually really powerful, because it is very good at, because that's a question that gets asked a lot. So the chances of it hallucinating there is a lot less. And then you will see them like sometimes challenge that, I don't think that's right. And then when I sit down with them and I go, okay, well, why don't you think it's right? That conversation on its own is already a really good starter. And that is essentially in that study that we were talking about. really important. So that's basically some AI support. They talked a lot about like almost like coaching support is very useful because it's quick, it's there. Um, I believe that this is where the role of teachers need to move towards a lot more towards a mentoring style kind of conversation. And again, there is some stuff that I think ChatGPT can do better, but if you have good teachers, there's some things that ChatGPT can't, and that has a lot to do with like sustained focus and other kind of metacognition things. But if they can't explain it back, they don't know it yet. Now you can either let them explain that back to the ChatGPT, but you can also just challenge them. It's like, you tell me what you've had, right? And I think the idea of written assessments are going to go a little bit becoming less and less important because they're easier to fake. And they become harder to write for some of the kids too. So I think this being able to explain what it is you're truly doing is actually more and more and more important, right? So realistically, what we need to say is that you have to create something first before you use AI, right? And what that means is like you have to do something physical. So can we use more physical things? Can you actually let them write creative things by themselves? And the dice that we've been handing out to a lot of our loyal customers, like for reviews and stuff, we're going to get a lot more of these dice. They're story dice. They're really fun to use, where you just roll a bunch of dice, get them to write a little story about it. We do a lot of stuff around journaling when it comes to our mentor kits as well. All these are attempts to try and help them get more comfortable with being creative in putting stuff down on paper. And you can do similar things at home. There's lots of little board games that you could use that are very interesting. There's an amazing board game called Concept that uses lots of symbols and stuff to try and like play kind of charades. Really good, really, really awesome. And again, it's all about like doing something physical with your hand. So if you can see that homework is being done by just being very simple sheets that are just being filled in, then you're probably going to end up with kids that are going to go, I might as well get ChatGPT to answer this. So how can you create more, enthusiastic kids by giving them more things to do? So what we say here is we build, we write, we draw, we design, and we experiment. We really try to make things happen. And then only try to get them to use AI to improve on what they have. So I think, yeah, that is the last slide for me. I hope these tips are useful. If you want a little tip on how to set up a GPT for your kids, then leave that in the the Q&A, because maybe we can take you through that. I think it's a really fun exercise to do with your kids. So can you sit down with them, like really understand how making a GPT or whatever version of that happens, or maybe even more complex by introducing it as an agent, right, where it can actually access certain other things, to say, okay, what is the safer version of this? So rather than going, you're not allowed to use ChatGPT this way, you're not allowed to ask you questions like that, say, okay, how can we build a GPT that does all those things? And like, how would you make that? Like, ask them, like, how would you implement that? What are the rules that you want your GPT to have? And this is also a very good way to do positive discipline. Like, it's in positive discipline, we do the same version of that, where we say, okay, come up with your own rules. But again, try not to do this until they're old enough. So I think 12 years is probably where that sits. But it's an opportunity for you to actually come up with your own rules. Now, with that said, I think that's enough for tonight. I hope it was useful. If you have any more questions, please leave them in the Q&A. This will be on our YouTube channel for people to watch, as always. And I want to thank you all for your time and wish you all a very good night. Thanks, Joyce.